Welcome dear students. Today I am going to deliberate on one of the most serious issues in one of the South Asian countries, namely Sri Lanka, formerly known as Ceylon, has for most of its independent history been marred with the ethnic conflict between the Tamil and Sinhala ethnic groups. In this lecture, I am going to provide you a historical outline of the trajectory of the ethnic conflict. However, it is very important to start first with the conceptualization of what is meant by ethnicity and ethnic conflict. As far as the term ethnicity is concerned, most of the scholars define it as that part of a person's identity which is drawn from one or more indicators like religion, race, region, shared history, social symbols or language. The taproot of an ethnic community, the ethne, has been defined by Anthony Smith, one of the celebrated authorities on the subject, as having a proper name, common myths of ancestry, shared memories, shared culture and a connection to a homeland. Therefore, in this way an ethnic group is a group of people who are bound together by a belief of common kinship and group distinctiveness, often reinforced by the indicators like religion, language and history. It is on the basis of this common belief or group distinctiveness that an ethnic group then feels an ethnic sentiment, which has been aptly articulated by Milton Esmond as an expression of who I am, how I identify myself, to what group of people I belong. As a member of that group, this becomes to me a collective identity. Consequently, this ethnic sentiment leads to ethnic solidarity, in which people express an in-group identity based on ethnicity. It is important to mention here that the concept of ethnicity is relational, which means having an in-group identity, means there is an out-group members of a different ethnic group. Ethnicity is a widely prevalent phenomenon today. It is found operating at local, regional and national and international levels. The ethnicization of politics and politicization of ethnicity is an intrinsic component of socio-political relations of a multi-ethnic and multicultural state. Now, coming to ethnic conflict. Any conflict which arises out of these ethnic sentiments or is characterized by any of the aforementioned indicators like race, language, history, region and religion is termed as ethnic conflict. An ethnic conflict, to begin with, differs from other types of conflict such as ideological ones because of the aspect of ascribed to identity that defines ethnicity. Ethnic groups may demand rights, status, territorial autonomy, representation in political institutions and power, and these demands may turn violent. However, that is not given. The ethnic conflict essentially can occur due to language policies, affirmative action laws and so forth. Thus, an ethnic conflict is a violent conflict between ethnic groups or between ethnic groups and government forces that consist of one or more different ethnic groups. There are two main types of conflict: group versus group conflict, with the government acting as a third party of some kind, and group versus government conflict, where the government is an active party acting on behalf of one ethnic group. A brief history of Tamil Sinhala composition. Now, coming to Sri Lanka, its present is haunted by the worst memories of the island's decades-long ethnic conflict, which culminated into a civil war in 1980s and ended in 2009 by the defeat of L28. The war is a classic case of ethnic conflict, as I discussed earlier, because it was a clash between the Sinhalese dominated Sri Lankan government and the minority Tamil group. Apart from the mainstream narrative that the conflict was derived from the tensions between the Sinhalese and Tamil ethnic groups, the war, however, also represented the legacy of British colonialism in South Asia. This forms the taproot of the argument of this lecture. However, it is pertinent to start with brief information about the historical origin as well as ethnic composition of these two groups. Neither the Tamils nor the Sinhala belong originally to Sri Lanka. We come to know from anthropologists that it was around the 5th century BC that migrants from northern India settled in the southern part of island. This group would become the Sinhalese population that now comprises 3/4 of the population of Sri Lanka. It is also being noted that roughly about the 3rd century BC, the Tamil population of southern India migrated and started to populate the northern region of Sri Lanka. It should be mentioned here that the Sinhala ethnic group constitutes 74.9% and the Tamil is 11.2% respectively. Besides, just over 7% of the population is Muslim, a legacy of the Arab seafaring merchants of later centuries, especially the 10th century onwards. Additionally, Christians maintain a significant presence in the coastal areas as a result of over 500 years of constant European colonial presence and the consequent Christianization of the significant numbers of the population in these areas. Both the Sinhala and Tamil are official languages in Sri Lanka, although linguistic division is the reality. The language of government is Sinhala. The elite typically can also speak English, and the Tamils in the north and east speak Tamil almost exclusively. A religious divide also exists, as the Tamils are mostly Hindus and the Sinhala are Buddhists. British colonialism and the roots of conflict. Although the Britishers were not the first ones to rule over Sri Lanka, many kingdoms existed in close proximity to each other. However, here we are only concerned with the British colonialism of the country. Nevertheless, a passing reference to the pre-British rule makes sense. It was in 1505 that the Portuguese arrived at the coast of Sri Lanka, which were later replaced by the Dutch and finally declared by British as a crown colony of the British Empire in 1798. However, it was not until 1818 that British extended administrative control over the entire colony and abolished all Sri Lankan administrations. The British occupation laid the roots for the ethnic conflict. British ideas of racial superiority and nationalism combined with ethnic differences that already existed on the island. It was during the British colonialism that tensions between the two ethnic groups worsened. The Britishers, like they did in other colonies like India, implemented the strategy of divide and rule to exacerbate differences between the Sinhalese majority and Tamil minority. The British would privilege a minority group, Tamils, with better education and government employment. This way, the majority group, Sinhalese, that was being discriminated against would direct their grievances towards their ethnic counterparts instead of the British colonizers. As reported by the CIA in 1985, the Sinhalese community felt threatened by the Tamil group's prosperity, partly due to the British favoritism of Tamils. Because Tamil communities also existed in several other British colonies like India, South Africa and Singapore. Sri Lankan Tamils benefited from broader commercial networks and a wider range of opportunities. Moreover, British colonial authorities often placed English language schools in predominantly Tamil areas, providing Tamils with more civil services and professional opportunities than their Sinhalese counterparts. This pattern of Tamil favoritism left Sinhalese people feeling isolated and oppressed. It was this Tamil domination buttressed by British that would later be used as a major justification for the Sinhalese preferential policies, which attempted to reverse these positions. Indeed, soon after British occupiers left the island in 1948, these patterns of Tamil dominance changed dramatically. Independence and aftermath. After the British left Sri Lanka on February 4, 1948, the pre-independence dominance of Tamils changed drastically as the administrative power fell into the hands of the Sinhalese, who began an onslaught of legislative discrimination against the Tamil population. The Sinhala-led United National Party (UNP) under the leadership of the Sinhala Don Stephen Sinanayake won the elections of 1947 and passed the first anti-Tamil legislation in 1948 known as the Ceylon Citizenship Act, which denied citizenship to the Tamils of Indian origin, roughly 800,000 labourers brought by the British from South India to work on rubber, tea and coffee estates, when the majority Sinhalese refused to work on foreign owned plantations. Additionally, in 1949, the Ceylon Amendment Act of 1949 was passed to disenfranchise plantation Tamils, dropping the proportion of Tamils with voting power in the new legislature. Approximately 350,000 were repatriated to India under the Indo-Ceylon Agreement of 1964. Over the years, subsequent governments conferred citizenship rights to the rest. The Ceylon Citizenship Act served to reinforce ethnic politics and reduced the electoral leverage of the Tamils, as one can gauge from the fact that their number of MPs was reduced from 11 in 1947 out of 95 to none in 1952. By 1950, the country's ethnic and religious conflicts escalated as competition for wealth and work intensified in the newly independent country. The Sinhalese, who felt resentful of their place under the British, wanted to reassert their culture, language, schools and Buddhist religion. Consequently, the 1956 election revolved around two major debates, the language and religion. The question was, what should be the official language of Sri Lanka and what role does Buddhism has to play? The 1956 election ushered in a left-led government and saw the UNP decline into second party stats. The ruling Mahajana Ek Pera Muna MEP promised to restore Buddhism, Sinhalese culture and Sinhala to a predominant position in the nation. Moreover, over 80% of the seats in the parliament were in Sinhalese hands, emphasizing that to rule the government to a party needed only to campaign to the Sinhala voters. And for the first time since independence, the government contained Muslims, Burghers and the Christians, but no Tamils. The new government fulfilled this promise through the passage of the so-called Sinhalese Only Bill, Official Language Act No. 33 of 1956. Soon after the election, giving no status of parity to the Tamil language, this Sinhala only law was partly designed to address the imbalance of power between the majority Sinhalese and the English-speaking Christian-educated elite. When the bill was introduced, Tamil political leaders were attacked in a 4-day riot that left more than 100 Tamils dead. The law limited the education and work opportunities for many Tamil youth. As a result, the Tamil Hindu minority started to push for a federal system of government with greater autonomy in the mainly Tamil areas in the north and east. While Tamils led demonstrations and protests, Sinhalese mobs violently murdered hundreds of Tamils across Sri Lanka. In 1959, a Buddhist monk assassinated the Prime Minister SWRD Bandaranaike, plunging the country into chaos. The widow of the slain Prime Minister Sirimava regrouped the government, and under her rule the Sinhala language policy and its repression of the Tamil people only grew worse. The Official Language Act provoked a series of grievances from the Tamil population against government organizations that now seem to discriminate on the basis of language, with a resulting lack of resource allocation to the Tamil population. It should be mentioned here that the continued and brutal marginalization of Tamils by Sinhala-led governments has catastrophic consequences for them in almost all walks of life. Let me elaborate the point by citing some statistical data here. While 30% of the Ceylon administration service, 50% of the clerical service, 60% of the engineers and doctors, 40% of the armed forces, and 40% of the labor forces in 1956. By 1970, they had plummeted to 5%, 5%, 10%, 1% and 5% respectively. The Sinhala only movement also bled into other forms of Tamil subordination, such as the colonization of Tamil homeland. Colonization of the northern and eastern provinces was another way in which the Sinhala government pushed for cultural assimilation, while completely neglecting the needs of the Tamil people. Much worse, in 1970s, even importing Tamil language books, magazines and films from the Tamil cultural hub of Tamil Nadu in India was also outlawed. However, the Tamil leadership tried on numerous occasions to work through the government to achieve its goals. On all these occasions, although promises of parity and protection were often made to the Tamil people, their demands were ultimately ignored. Thus, the demand for a separate state for Tamils, Tamil Elim, emerged, which paved the way for the formulating of Liberation Tigers of Tamil Elim (LTTE) in 1976. And what was ethnic conflict was soon to become ethnic and civil war. The Civil War began on July 3, 1983, when LTTE carried its first major attack. The LTTE ambushed an army convoy, killing 13 soldiers. News of fallen Sinhalese soldiers set off an anti-Tamil rampage in Colombo and elsewhere. The incident sparked the 1983 anti-Tamil riots, and bloody civil war broke out that left more than 100,000 dead and around 800,000 displaced. When the dust settled, thousands of Tamils had been displaced from their homes and their business uprooted. Many Tamils were forced to migrate to the northern parts of the country, mainly to the city of Jaffna. The civil war lasted for almost 3 decades, when the LTT demand for a separate state was crushed by the brutal crackdown of the organization by the government. It is pertinent to mention here that LTT was an uncompromising group inspired by Che Guevara and his guerrilla warfare tactics. The US Federal Bureau of Investigation (FBI) soon labeled the LTT a terrorist group after they initiated terror tactics including suicide bombers, the suicide belt and female-led suicide attacks. The group even assassinated 2 world leaders, Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi and Sri Lankan President Ranasinghe Premadasa. Indeed, the LTT's activities extended beyond Sri Lanka's borders. However, LTT was not the only perpetrator of heinous crimes during the Sri Lankan Civil War. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights determined that the Sinhalese dominated government has also been implicated in war crimes such as the torture of war prisoners and citizen disappearances. In one notable brutal example, the government forces murdered 5 Tamil students in the port city of Trincomalee. Even the military was alleged to have executed the 12-year-old son of the LTT leader after his killing. Now, ceasefire and SLMM. Neither the post peace accords between the 2 ethnic communities and nor even the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord could solve the intractable conflict. Consequently, in the beginning of the 21st century, the Sri Lanka government and the LTT were once again trapped in a stalemate condition where military solution seemed unrealistic. This critical situation coincided with the Norwegian government's offer to facilitate between the warring parties in early 2000. It is important to note that the small Scandinavian state of Norway was a key facilitator and mediator of peace talks between the government and the LTTE. As a consequence, a permanent ceasefire agreement between the government of Sri Lanka and the LTTE was signed on 22 February 2002, sponsored by Norway. The conflicting parties requested Norway to establish an international monitoring group called the Sri Lanka Monitoring Mission (SLMM) in order to monitor the implementation of the ceasefire agreement. The SLMM included the members from the 5 Nordic countries: Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark and Iceland. However, the monitoring mission had only inquiring and determining powers, but lacked implementation power. After the 6 rounds of the talks, the LTTE pulled out of the peace talks completely in April 2003, claiming that they had been marginalized during the negotiations. The LTTE were running a de facto state of their controlled areas in the northeast provinces called Tamil Elam, which has a flag, a national anthem, court, police forces and a tax system. They demanded legitimacy for the state and proposals for an interim self-governing authority for the Tamil people in the northeast of Sri Lanka. The LTTE asserted that the proposal of an interim government was to be accepted in order for them to return to the negotiation table. Now, the final war to end the war. Mahinda Rajapaksa became president of Sri Lanka in 2005 and demanded abrogation of the ceasefire agreement, stating that the ethnic conflict could only have a military solution and that the only way to achieve this was by eliminating the LTTE. Military confrontation continued into 2007 and 2008. In January 2008, the government officially pulled out of the ceasefire agreement. By 2 August 2008, LTTE lost the Mannar district following the fall of Valankulam town, followed by many important towns during the final months of 2008. On 2 January 2009, the President of Sri Lanka, Rajapaksa, announced that the Sri Lankan troops had captured Kilinochchi, the city which the LTTE had used for over a decade as its de facto administrative capital. On the same day, President Rajapaksa called upon LTTE to surrender. As of 8 January 2009, the LTTE abandoned its positions on the Jaffna Peninsula to make a last stand in the jungles of Mulatavia, their last man base. The Jaffna Peninsula was captured by Sri Lankan army by 14th January. On 25th January 2009, the Sri Lankan army troops completely captured Mulatava town, the last major LTTE stronghold. President Rajapaksa declared military victory over the Tamil Tigers on 16th May 2009 after 26 years of conflict, when the leader of LTTE, Vellupillai Prabhakaran, was killed. It is important to point out here that Sri Lanka's victory over the LTTE would not have been possible without the logistical help from China. Beijing helped Colombo in terms of weapons and ammunition to wipe out the LTTE. Conclusion. Well, in this lecture, I provided you a historical outline of the ethnic conflict that culminated into a brutal civil war in Sri Lanka that lasted for more than 2 decades. We discussed the role of British colonialism in sowing the seeds of the conflict that got manifested in the post-independent trajectory of Sri Lanka, where no stone was left unturned to marginalize and terrorize the minority Tamil community by successive Sinhala-led governments. We also discussed how a separate demand for a Tamil Elam got formed under the LTTE headed by Prabhakaran, and consequently how the civil war started. We then also discussed the peace efforts most notably the role of Norway and SLMM. Finally, I discussed with you the Sri Lankan government's decision under Mahindra Rajapaksa to finally end the war by a brutal war against the LTTE. However, uncertainty remains as to how the tension between the ethnic groups will be managed and whether conflict will resume in the future. A large portion of the Tamil population remains displaced. While there are fewer political and civil rights issues, instances of torture and enforced disappearances persist even in recent years. Moreover, the Sri Lankan government often surveils and tracks people linked to LTTE. The Sri Lankan military still occupies predominantly Tamil areas designated as high security zones, though to a lesser extent than during the war. What this means for the future of Sri Lanka is unclear. Still, one thing is for sure: even if the wounds caused by the Sri Lankan civil war and its accompanying ethnic divisions heal, the country will remain haunted by much larger structural issues in its history and government. However, a unified citizenry in Sri Lanka could be a powerful tool in responding to its government's growing power. Ethnic unity on the island may be the key to a more secure future. With this, we are signing off our today's lecture. Hope you have enjoyed it. Thanks for watching it.